Good afternoon and welcome to this learning video. In Microsoft Excel, we know that there are what we call pivot tables that allow us to analyze our data very effectively and quickly. Well, I'm going to show you how you can take 3 pivot tables and 3 associated charts with them, as well as a slicer, and put it into what we call a dashboard. Think of the dashboard kind of like one-stop shopping, where you'll be able to tell your story, your visual story, at one glance. And whenever there are modifications that you make in how you want to view that story, everything on that screen will update. Pretty neat, huh? And then I'll probably throw in a couple other tips and tricks along the way to make your life easier. Remember, work smarter, not harder. Okay, so I've got a pivot table here. Or I'm sorry, I've got a list here that I'm going to convert into a pivot table. Before I do that, it is a table. Now, someone may come up and say, well, Tom, how do you know it's a table? Someone may have just formatted it to make it look like a table with the bands on different rows. But here's how you know it's a table. There's a table design tab when I click in it. Aha, that's how you know. The absence of the table design tab when you're clicking in the middle of the data will mean that it's just a list. Now I bring that up because when we are converting our data from this row and column format into a pivot table, Microsoft recommends that we have it set up as a table. It just makes for smoother access, smoother transitions from one component of the list to another, meaning that if I take this data over here and copy and paste it right down at the bottom, which is what I'm going to do, it automatically becomes part of the table. Formulas, formatting, etc., without me having to do any extra steps. So here we go. I will just paste it, and there you go. It is now part of the actually I did it twice, as you can see here. It is now part of the large list. Now I'm just going to undo that just so that my data is just consistent. So now we are ready to create a pivot table. Number 1, I click inside the table, then I go to my insert tab, click pivot table, and then I click OK. What's going to happen is a new sheet is going to be inserted right in front of where the data is coming from. Now, what a lot of people will do is they want additional pivot tables from the list or from the table. They'll go back to the sheet with the table on it and do the same thing. And each time you do that, you have a separate sheet for each pivot table. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a good thing to do. It's just that for this purpose, I don't need to do that. I'm going to have all 3 pivot tables and the graphs associated with them all on one sheet. So while I'm thinking about it, let me rename the sheet. I'll call it PT Pivot Table Sales. All right, now I'm just going to start off with the first one being a real simple one. I want to see what my sales are for the products. There they are. Pretty easy. Now, if I would go back in here and insert rows and columns in this table, the associated pivot tables would automatically update along with it and include the new data. However, if I make any changes to the individual cells in the table, then I must go here and do a refresh to update the changes. Just want to give you a heads up on that. A lot of people asked me about that and I wanted to clarify that. Okay, so I'm going to create a chart, a pie chart. A pie chart is great when you want to compare a percentage of the whole. And that's what I want to do. I want to see each of the slices for each of these products. These are fruits: apples, bananas, cherries, grapes, and peaches. So here we go. It's this button right here called Pivot Chart. There's my pie. Let's make it 3-dimensional. I click OK. And here's my graph. There's my pie graph. Now I'm just going to tighten this up a little bit. Okay. And there we go. And the neat thing about this is, I don't know if you know this about three-dimensional graphs, but you can rotate by right-clicking. 3D rotation. And then over here, I can play with the X and Y rotation degrees. Look at that. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. You can only do that on 3D graphs, not two-dimensional graphs. Okay, now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this pivot table report. Control C, Control V. There you go, that was painless. I now have two pivot tables on the same sheet. Now, I don't want this one to be duplicated, I want to change it. So I go back into my pivot table fields and I'm going to drag the quarter field into the columns, and voila. That was pretty easy, wasn't it? Now what I want to do is I want to create a chart that is based on this pivot table. I click inside the pivot table report, same thing, go to my pivot table, analyze, click pivot chart. This time I want it to be a column graph, and I'll choose three-dimensional, and just like that, I've got my second graph, and it is associated with this pivot table report. Now I'm going to do this one more time, copy, and I'm going to paste it over here. I now have a third one, but I don't want to duplicate this, so I'm going to swap out the quarterly data, and I'm going to replace it with region data. There you go. Pretty easy, huh? Now I'm going to, again, have a graph associated with this pivot table report. Same type, column, three-dimensional. I click OK. And there is my third graph. All right, now, starting to shape up pretty good, correct? The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to flavor it up a little bit so that they don't look almost identical here. They got the same background, they kind of look the same. Well, I want to be able to differentiate between them, so I'll flavor it up a little bit by formatting them. So there we go. You can see I've flavored it up a little bit, added some color, and what I did to do that was I did a lot of right-clicking, and I'm a big advocate of right-clicking and using these programs. In fact, just to show you something, if you see me driving on I-95, that's me. Right click. You know what? I've always wanted to get pulled over by a cop. And if the cop comes up to my window and, you know, he's going to maybe mention, what's this about the license plate? Right click. So I'll show him my hand that I use when I click the mouse button, usually my right hand. And I tell him while I'm working on my programs, I have a mouse, and when I left click, I use my index finger. And when I want to learn a lot about these programs, I right click and I show him my middle finger. So that's the only way that I could flip the bird to a cop and not get in trouble for it. All right. So anyway, I did a lot of right clicking here, and one example is when you right click there at the corner, it says format chart area. And that's how I got into changing the gradient and the fill background of this graph. Same thing over here and here as well. You'll notice on the pie graph though, I also took a slice and I cut it out to give it some visual effect. Pretty neat, huh? Now I didn't have to do a right click on that. I'll show you what I did. What I did was I just dragged one of the slices away from the center of the pie, and it gives it that nice effect. All right, now I want to insert a couple more rows up here because that's where I'm going to add my slicer. Now the slicer that I'm going to create is going to be based off of this middle pivot table, just because I could have had it from the other two if I wanted to, but I'll start with this one. Number one, I click inside the pivot table report. I go to pivot table analyze, and there's a button right there called insert slicer. And when I click it, the window pops up that allows me to choose which column I want to trace. or follow. So I click on the product button, click OK, and now I've got my slicer. Now I'm going to move it. Notice that when the slicer is selected, I have a slicer tab that was not present before. And one of the options here, over here on the right, is I want to change from 1 column to 5. That way it'll give me a little bit more real estate space. So I size it and I move it. Now all of the items in the slicer are selected. All 5 products. Well, watch what happens to this graph underneath it when I deselect all 5 and only choose, let's say, bananas. I hold down my favorite key on the keyboard, which is Control, and I want to see and compare peaches with bananas. So there you go. But it's not painting the entire picture or telling the whole story that I want to tell it, because I want all 6 objects to update when I modify my slicer. Well, how do I do that? Well, first of all, let me identify these pivot table reports. In other words, let me name them. Makes it easier when I get to connect them. So how do I do that? How do I name them is, number 1, I click on the pivot table. And right here on the Pivot Table Analyze tab is this box over here called Pivot Table Name. Well, I want to make it meaningful, like Pie Sales, Pie Products. There we go. And I press Enter. Now I do the same thing with this pivot table. I select it and I name it over here. I'm going to call this Col for column, and then quarters. Press Enter. You guessed it, the third one is going to be called Col Region. It's a column graph tracking regions. And press Enter. Okay, now I want to now connect or marry or link, whatever term you want to use, all 6 of these objects to the slicer, and it's not right now. So I select the slicer, and on the slicer tab is a button called Report Connections. Now, you know me, I also like to right click, so I right click on the slicer and Report Connections is there as well. So it doesn't matter which way I do it. What happens is the Report Connections dialog box comes up telling me right now that it's for product, which is the checkbox that I chose when I inserted the slicer. And you'll notice that only one of the pivot table reports is selected, the one in the middle, column quarters. Well, all I have to do is select the other 2. And you can see they're named, so I know that I'm selecting the correct ones. I click OK. Now, you can see that these outside 2 graphs and pivot table reports updated because it's now reflecting the peaches and bananas. Now, when I go up to my slicer and modify, you'll see that all 6 components update automatically. It's a beautiful thing. So, someone's going to take a look at this for the first time and not maybe know what to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give like a little instruction right here on the title of the slicer. And watch how I do that. I go to the slicer tab and I choose slicer settings. And right here, it says caption, product. Well, I want to change that to something meaningful like select all that apply. I click OK, and there you go. Someone looking at this for the first time may read that and say, okay, I know that I can select different items. Pretty neat. Now this button right here will delete the currently selected items and bring them all back. This button right here with the funnel and the red X on it. And now I'm back to showing everything. Now, the next thing I want to do is say how we can expand our story, if you will, by adding another layer of data. Because right now I'm looking at the column graph that's breaking down the sales for each of these products. Suppose I want to see the region as an extra layer within the actual products. How do I do that? I'm going to click on the graph and Then I'm going to drag the regions field. Actually, I don't even have to drag it. It automatically put it in the correct quadrant down here. That's for my data, right under product. And I see my regions for each product. Now, I know it's not that easy to read. It's overlapping, but I can move this and then I can size it. But again, the bottom line is my visual story just has now another layer to it. Now, suppose someone comes along and says, oh, that's great, Tom, but I want it to go back to the way it was before. No, you don't have to delete it and start all over again. The undo button is not an acceptable answer. So this little button down here has got a plus and a minus. I'm going to click on the minus button, and it's subtracted the new layer that I had just added and brought it back to the way it was before. When I click on the plus sign, it returns. Pretty cool, huh? All right, now, the last thing is I want to show you is to make it truly look like a dashboard, I want to get rid of the grid lines, I want to get rid of the formula bar, and I want to get rid of the column headers and row headers. How do I do that? Well, it's simple. I go to my View tab, I turn off headings, I turn off grid lines, and I would turn off the formula bar. And it has a nice cleaner look to it, doesn't it? All right, I hope this learning video has helped you understand more about how to tell your story with more effectiveness and more clarity. As always, I share my email address so that if anyone has questions about any Microsoft Office products, not just Excel, I'm only an email away. My rates are very reasonable. I've been doing this a long time. I'm not a perfect expert at all these programs, but I know quite a bit and probably a little bit more than you do. Tom at leadingedgebizservices.com. Microsoft Access, Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint, Microsoft Outlook, Microsoft Publisher, Microsoft Project, Microsoft Visio, Microsoft OneDrive, Microsoft OneNote, Microsoft Teams, Microsoft Windows. I support every one of those. All right, hope to hear from you soon. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.